Busta Rhymes wasn't thinking about the competition. Busta Rhymes wasn't thinking about the competition. Nobody ever really was. But that leather jacket changed the energy in the room, and suddenly, the quiet got loud. For years, the real story connecting 50 Cent, Diddy, and Busta Rhymes was never erased. It was managed. While the public caught glimpses of surface-level tension and scattered remarks, a far more complex web of influence, loyalty, and quiet pressure was already determining what stayed in the shadows. This documentary moves beyond speculation to examine how proximity to figures like Diddy shapes who speaks freely, who goes silent, and which stories never find their way to the surface. With Busta Rhymes at the center of that silence, what begins as industry gossip evolves into something with far more weight, control, perception, and the power to define what becomes part of the record. Ultimately, one question remains: who decides when the truth is finally allowed to exist? Busta has always been a visual artist, a performer built for the stage. But the image and the reputation aren't always the same thing. Those who move in industry circles have long carried certain knowledge, not as rumor, but as background noise accepted without much examination. Promoters talked. Insiders observed. And those who stayed close enough to the room began to understand things that never made it onto a stage or into an interview. The documentary opens not with direct accusation, but with pattern recognition. Clips surface. Comments surface. Isolated moments scattered across platforms that, taken individually, seem disconnected until they don't. What once looked like background noise slowly assembles itself into something that demands attention. The significance isn't found in any single statement. It lives in the repetition, the timing, and the momentum that builds before facts have a chance to catch up. In a digital environment where perception calcifies faster than investigation can begin, one question rises above the noise. When perception outruns the truth, how much time does truth actually have to defend itself? When asked directly about Diddy and the growing wave of allegations, Busta's response was deliberate. He offered caution over clarity, choosing the language of patience and prayer rather than position. He spoke of waiting for truth to manifest, of being mindful about what gets said and when. For some, that response felt principled. For others, it raised more questions than it answered, particularly because it offered nothing about his own relationship with Diddy. No confirmation. No denial. No mention of whether he had been to the parties, the after-parties, or any of the spaces now under scrutiny. There was a time when the connection between 50 Cent and Busta Rhymes felt untouchable. Shared stages, mutual respect, the kind of quiet loyalty that holds inside an industry where visibility often comes with a cost. The documentary treats that history not as nostalgia, but as essential context, because silence only carries meaning when a strong bond once existed behind it. As controversy surrounding these names intensified, the unity that once seemed unshakable began giving way to measured distance. What reads as absence on the surface may actually be something more calculated beneath it. And when relationships built over decades grow quiet at the exact moment they're most needed, the tension becomes impossible to dismiss. Is that silence an act of loyalty or survival? The accounts that emerge from those who moved in those circles are not dramatic revelations. They're casual observations delivered with the confidence of someone describing something everyone in a certain world already understood. Backstage arrangements. Section dynamics. The kind of behavior noticed by security, by promoters, by people whose job required them to pay close attention. What makes these accounts sit differently is not their shock value, it's their consistency. The same pattern, described by different people, across different settings, over many years. What makes the documentary genuinely unsettling is not the original remarks themselves, but the machinery that surrounds them. A comment gets clipped. The clip travels. And through sheer repetition, it begins to resemble evidence. Conflict in this environment is rarely accidental. It is shaped, intensified, and converted into currency. Context disappears because outrage moves faster and reaches further than explanation ever will. The industry doesn't pause to examine meaning, it responds to engagement, momentum, and reaction. When attention becomes the ultimate reward, the conversation shifts towards something more uncomfortable. In a system structurally built to profit from distortion, who still has any real incentive to protect the truth? The behavior described wasn't hidden. It was visible in real time to anyone present. And yet the response from those around it was largely silence, not out of ignorance, but out of priority. Access mattered. Proximity mattered. Being in the section, being at the shoot, being able to say you were there, that mattered more to most people than anything they might have witnessed. The loyalty wasn't to truth. It was to position. And that calculation, repeated endlessly across the industry, is exactly how certain things remain known and unspoken at the same time. The documentary moves into more volatile territory when identity and personal life become subjects of public entertainment rather than private conversation. Hip-hop has long treated masculinity as both protection and performance, a space where ridicule and critique blur into each other. But the consequences here reach beyond image management. Perception spreads fast. Stigma outlasts nuance. The damage lingers long after the moment that caused it has been forgotten. Rather than delivering a verdict, the narrative asks a more uncomfortable question: whether the culture has genuinely evolved far enough to recognize what casual dehumanization actually costs, and at what point commentary stops being content and starts becoming harm. The accounts from those present are not embellished. They're almost matter-of-fact, which in some ways makes them land harder. An observation made in passing. A moment that registered and was filed away, not as scandal, but as confirmation of what was already understood. And when the speaker notes that the person in question was so happy and couldn't believe it, what emerges is not an indictment, but a portrait of someone who felt, in that moment, genuinely seen. The complexity of that sits uncomfortably alongside everything else being said. Rather than responding with denial or public defense, 50 Cent's approach throughout all of this has been strategic precision, humor deployed not as deflection, but as leverage. In the digital era, a short, repeatable, shareable moment travels infinitely further than a lengthy explanation. Power shifts toward whoever controls what gets replayed. The joke lands before the context does. That's not an accident. It reflects a sharp understanding of how modern influence actually operates. Once the audience reacts, the narrative is often already fixed. But strategy carries weight and consequence. When humor begins functioning less like entertainment and more like sustained pressure, the line between persuasion and imbalance becomes harder to locate. Busta's call for restraint regarding Diddy carries multiple interpretations depending on where you stand. To some, it reads as loyalty, the kind built through years of shared industry experience. To others, it suggests a caution shaped by closeness to power and an understanding of how that power operates when it feels threatened. The documentary doesn't resolve that ambiguity. It holds it open because in environments where reputation and legacy govern behavior, silence is never truly neutral. Every quiet response carries its own meaning, and the meaning it carries depends entirely on what came before it. The exchange that follows between the two, the leather jacket, the products, the Rico Suave references, plays publicly as comedy. And for those who understand the history, it reads partly as that. But it also reads as a message delivered in a language designed to be undeniable while remaining technically deniable. 50 has always understood that the most effective commentary often arrives dressed as a joke. By the time anyone decides how to respond, the crowd has already made up its mind. As the atmosphere shifts and audiences begin questioning their own role in amplifying these moments, moral scrutiny starts replacing casual reaction. Brands reassess. Industry relationships quietly adjust. Even passing association begins to carry consequence. Visibility, once a form of protection, starts accelerating judgment instead. But beneath the public reaction sits a harder question. When opinion suddenly turns, is it actually driven by principle or by the instinct to create distance before the fallout expands to include everyone nearby? The arrival of legal developments throughout this narrative functions like a series of false endings, dismissed claims, revised headlines, narrowed arguments, each one treated by some as closure when it is anything but. The documentary returns to a recurring confusion between legal process and moral outcome. Procedural updates are absorbed as verdicts. Evidence thresholds are mistaken for the full picture. The law operates through measured standards, not public emotion or platform momentum. Yet modern discourse rarely slows down long enough to separate the two. As headlines move faster than understanding, a deeper concern surfaces. When audiences consume legal developments as emotional wins or losses, does truth ever actually get the room it needs to emerge? The documentary argues that the distance between legality and accountability is vast, and often kept that way on purpose. Technical outcomes can be absorbed by public opinion as proof of innocence long before the deeper questions have been addressed. But rather than dwelling on verdicts, the narrative pivots towards something more subtle. In an era governed by optics, strategic messaging, and the management of perception, responsibility is no longer defined solely by what can be proven in a courtroom. It becomes tied to influence, to behavior, and to the impact left on people and institutions long after the formal proceedings end. And as public attention continues moving faster than reflection allows, one question lingers in the space the documentary refuses to fill. In a culture shaped almost entirely by appearances, where does genuine accountability actually begin? By its final chapter, this documentary has reframed the entire conversation, not as a conflict between personalities, but as an examination of systems operating quietly beneath everything visible. Networks of influence, strategic silence, manufactured outrage, and selective memory all converge to determine what the public is permitted to see and what remains carefully managed out of view. Hip-hop is presented here not only as culture, but as a form of informal governance, where power moves through relationships, reputation, and access in ways that never require a formal announcement. The story ends without resolution, only with tension left deliberately in place. Everyone in these spaces claims to value transparency. But true transparency has the potential to destabilize entire structures built on loyalty and the things that go unsaid. And if speaking the full truth carries real professional and personal consequence, then the final question this documentary leaves behind may be the most honest one it ever asks. In a world built on that kind of silence, who is ever truly in a position to tell it? If this kind of content makes you think, drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more, you already know what to do.